going well. So Turkey is struggling with hyperinflation and large-scale unemployment. So Sinem, let's start with you. We have Sinem Adar from German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP. I'm checking Samuel is not here, I guess. He'll be joining later. We have also Samuel Doveri Westerby from European Neighborhood Council. Alper Kaliber from Altınbaş University will act as a discussant. So since Sinem is here, we will start with you. So, I mean, I already saw your policy briefs, papers. You already wrote intensely on Turkey relations after Russian war. So how do you feel? What do you think? How come Turkey, play this balancing act, especially at a time when Europe is more ambitious for a strong defense policy after Denmark's green light? So 15 minutes, floor is yours, Sinem.
Thank you, Didem, for the kind introduction, and thank you also, Alper, for the kind invitation. It's great to be here. I would like to basically, what I'm going to say at the very end, I will say it at the beginning, and then I'll kind of elaborate on it throughout the 15 minutes. The way I see it is that even though the war has led to a conjunctural rapprochement or accentuated an already existing rapprochement that started during 2021 between the EU and Turkey, and in general between Turkey and the West, I would say, I think the future of EU-Turkey relations will remain to be bleak and will remain to be frictious and basically with tensions. And I'll basically kind of elaborate on why I think this will be the case in three parts. I'll first start with kind of like the moment when the war erupted and what it means for the EU-Turkey relations. I will then continue with the European perceptions about Turkey's role within the war or in the wake of the war, and how Turkey has been, in my opinion, interpreting the situation. And this is kind of like also a temporal narrative, if you will, then I will kind of shift to the later phases, or the kind of like more recent phases of the war, as it is turning into a more protracted form, and the question marks that have been in a way raised about Turkey and Turkey's role and Turkey's so-called balancing act. And then at the very end, I will basically come back to what I said earlier and kind of give a couple of points about why I think that the future will also be bleak, even if there will be a change in government in Turkey in 2023. Now, as you all know, EU-Turkey relations were already at a kind of high time low when the war erupted, and there are a couple of reasons why the EU-Turkey relations were at a high time low. It's partially because of the democratic deterioration that has been taking place since the late 2000s in Turkey, but has entered into a new phase, I would say, first with the failed coup attempt in 2016, and then the constitutional referendum in 2017, and finally the transition into the presidential system. Basically, the three events that in a way put the last three nails in the coffin of Turkey's democratic aspirations. In addition to that, of course, the shift to a confrontation and militaristic foreign policy since 2016 led to serious frictions with the EU. And I would also add to this, to the factors which kind of like led to deterioration in relations of Turkey with the EU since the late 2000s, also the short-sightedness of the EU, and we can come back to that in the question and answer session if you would like. Now, even though the relations have been at a high time low, Turkey has already kind of like started, as you all know, its efforts to mend broken ties both with the US and the EU after the election of Biden in the US. And of course, these efforts kind of overlap with rapprochement efforts with various countries in the region as well, such as Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, against this backdrop, in a way, the war, I think, has provided Turkey with quite of a good opportunity to continue on this path of mending ties, broken ties with its Western allies, and within that, of course, the EU. Now, when it comes to how the war and Turkey's role within the war has been perceived by both European leaders, but also by Turkey. On the European side, I think the war in a way has kind of accentuated, has emphasized the importance of Turkey, particularly within NATO and to NATO. And here, of course, a couple of factors are important to mention. First and foremost, as you all know, Turkey is the second largest army of the alliance and within the alliance. And second, its control over the straits and the Monroe Convention, I think has puts Turkey in a kind of an important position. And indirectly, of course, the fact that Turkey is a trusted partner or seen as a trusted partner, both by Ukraine and Russia, I think led in the early days of the war, lack of, if you will, complaints by European leaders, but also the US about Turkey, for instance, not joining the EU sanctions regime or not closing its airspace to Russia. And there has, again, in the early days of the war, I think there was a quite positive reception of Turkey's mediation efforts between Ukraine and Russia. So overall, I think Turkey's balancing, the so-called balancing act between Ukraine and Russia has been tolerated, if you will, by its Western allies. Now, on the Turkish side, I think what the war did, again, in its early days, it significantly challenged one of the main assumptions of Turkish foreign policy since 2016, that the West is in terminal decline. And that has to do with basically the rather unexpected but rapid unity within the geopolitical West when it comes to, for instance, taking the decision to apply sanctions to Russia and so on. So I think this significantly challenged that working assumption of Turkish foreign policy. And at the same time, of course, I think in the eyes of Turkey, a very strong Russia sitting along the coast of Black Sea is not favorable. It's not in the interest of Turkey. So in that sense, so I think Turkey has been neither a very weak Russia nor a very strong Russia is in the interest of Turkey. Yet at the same time, again, as many of you in this call are aware of, that in the last 10 years, Turkey has developed quite an asymmetrical relationship with Russia. That also, of course, makes it very difficult to kind of take an openly confrontational position against Russia. So against this backdrop, I think comes Turkey's so-called balancing act between Ukraine and Russia. On the one hand, Turkey sells drones to Ukraine, but at the same time, it closed the straits to all the parties, not only to Russia. So I think that's an important detail to mention. Yet it doesn't join the sanctions regime. And there has recently been serious, I think, concerns among different circles about the possibility that Turkey might help Russia circumvent the sanctions regime. But here, I think one very important thing to emphasize is that Turkey is certainly not alone in striking a balancing act between Ukraine and Russia, or the West and Russia, if you will. It's definitely a pro in striking a balancing act, but I think Turkey's so-called balancing act really fits into the kind of into a norm that we see more and more emerging outside of the West, as the war is now entering into a phase of protracted war. But exactly at this moment, I think, come a lot of question marks whether the war as a geopolitical rupture would be a driving force to set the EU-Turkey relations back on a path of repair, as I think was suggested by some Turkey observers and analysts in the early days of the war, that this is a significant geopolitical rupture and Turkey is kind of anchored institutionally in the West, in the geopolitical West. And because of this geopolitical rupture would basically push Turkey closer to the West. Now, as I said earlier, as we are kind of entering into this protracted phase, I think there are more concerns than kind of convictions about the possibility that this would happen. And a couple of events here, I think, buzz significantly in the ears of Turkey watchers, Turkey experts, and also the decision makers, particularly in the West. Whether or not these events are related to one another, I think it's an open question and open to discussion. But then I'm happy to talk about it in the question and answer. But just to basically name those events, of course, first and foremost, the Turkey's blockade of Sweden and Finland's NATO accession, then the recent statements about a possible new operation in northern Syria, the dogfight with Greece over the Aegean Islands, and the recent developments in Cyprus. Now, in my opinion, it's not very clear to argue that these events are part of a coherent strategy on the side of Turkey, but they certainly raise questions concerning 2 points. First is the very question about Turkey's reliability within NATO. And that, I think, has 2 dimensions, perhaps also 3 dimensions. The first is that at a time when public display of NATO unity and cohesion is more important than ever, I think the ways in which Turkey has been blocking Sweden and Finland's NATO accession is really raising eyebrows about whether Turkey puts its national interests over those of the alliance. And that basically means that whether, I think at the very heart of it lies the question whether actually Turkey's understanding of the war fits or overlaps with the European and the Western understanding of the war and its geopolitical repercussions. The second point, or the second basically point of concern, hesitation, suspicion, is the nature of Turkey's relations with Russia. Here, I think, again, particularly the blocking Sweden and Finland's NATO accessions, I think raised a lot of questions about whether Turkey's relations with Russia has a strategic dimension. And again, for instance, the Lavrov's visit last week in Istanbul and the meeting with its counterparts, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, and not having Ukraine on the negotiation table and even kind of discussing, without having Ukraine on the table, removing the mines from the Black Sea coast, which are obviously, I think, kind of like a defense for Ukraine at the face of the Russian aggression. I think these are all events that kind of like strengthen the conviction that Turkey might not necessarily be a reliable NATO actor. Now, in addition to the concerns about Turkey's reliability, I think another point of suspicion concerns after basically almost the 1.5 years of tuning down of the foreign policy, confrontation foreign policy. Again, the statements against Greece and the developments in Cyprus, I think, raise questions about whether Turkey is back to its confrontational path. So that's, and again, I don't necessarily have answers to these questions, but I think these are all kind of question marks in the eyes and the minds of Turkey's Western allies. Now, where does this all leave us in terms of the future of EU-Turkey relations? As I said at the very beginning of my talk, I think in the short to mid-term, the relations will remain to be full of frictions and tensions. And that it will remain to be full of frictions and tensions because, first and foremost, I think given that the EU-Turkey relations is for none of the parties, neither for the EU nor for Turkey, is a choice but inevitable because of the very deep economic, social, and geographical ties. So the relations will continue. They have to continue. It's not a choice that they will not continue. But at the same time, the last 10 years, I think, left quite significant legacies in terms of confronting the EU, but also the West. And these legacies of the last 10 years, I think, kind of build on the historical grievances that Turkey has when it comes to its relations with its Western allies. And there, of course, the very known files we all know in this call, it's basically Greece, the Aegean Islands, which keep coming up, Cyprus, and the Kurdish issue. So these are not going to go anywhere, even if there is a new government in Turkey in 2023. Thus, I think frictions will be inevitable, even if the style of conducting diplomacy might be different. the issues that remain to be problematic between the EU and Turkey will be there. And of course, another reason why I think the relations will remain to be frictious is that the rise of anti-Westernism as a new fault line, I think, in Turkish politics. And here, I think one needs to kind of qualify what we mean by anti-Westernism, because in my reading, it has mostly to do with anti-Americanism than anti-Europeanism, if you will, Turkish anti-Westernism, but still, it's kind of this anti-Western attitudes are quite prevalent within the public discussion, and to the extent of, I would even basically go as far as saying that they kind of manage to filtrate into the mainstream. So, and they are also not very easy for that matter to kind of to undo in the short term, even if there is the will to do so. So I think these are kind of like the three reasons why the relations will remain to be tense. Now, against this backdrop, the second point that I want to make in terms of the future of EU-Turkey relations, I think the prospects for membership are slimmer than ever, as it was also pointed in the most recent Turkey report of the European Parliament. But here I would like to kind of add a nuance, because I think actually the real issue is not, in my opinion, is not even about the membership, because if you really kind of like look at both the academic literature, but also the expert discussions that have been taking place since the late 2000s about the future of EU-Turkey relations. Actually, there you see, I think the discussion about an alternative framework to membership has been there in the last 10 years. So actually, we are kind of like going in a circle and discussing what this alternative framework should consist of. But I think where we are at the moment, the downgrade is not from membership to a privileged partnership. The downgrade is from a privileged partnership to a relationship that is beneficial to both parties, as it was worded in the strategic compass document. So in a way, it's kind of like, it's a significant downgrade compared to the late 2000s. But again, I think at the center of the discussion is not the member. It has not been the membership in the last 10 years anyways. And against this backdrop, I think the short to medium term, there is no escape from transactionalism, unfortunately. It's going to be, and again, even if there's a change in government in Turkey in 2023, transactionalism, I think, will be the main kind of the pillar of the EU-Turkey relations. And last but not least, I would like to just like close up with a couple of comments about the security dimension. I think what the war has shown to Europe, but also like I think outside of Europe as well, and when it comes to European security, NATO is the main carrier of European security, despite all the talk about a brain dead NATO. But that's, of course, I think kind of it creates a paradox in itself, in the sense that on the one hand, I think the war itself finally gives the impetus to what it has been so far, quite an intellectual discussion about European strategic autonomy. I think it gives the impetus to put that intellectual discussion finally to practice. But at the same time, it has also shown quite starkly to Europeans that the US and the UK play a very significant role when it comes to European security. But at the same time, given the uncertainties about the US elections in 2024, I think it's kind of like the paradox is there, like what's going to happen in the US and whether Europe can continue to rely on the US. And there, I think one thing that might, I mean, obviously this is a speculation, but I think the cooperation between the NATO and the EU and the strengthening of the European pillar of the NATO will be on the table as a discussion point. And there again, the question, I think, when it comes to Turkey's relations with the EU in terms of security and defense, one significant question is that to what extent Turkey and the EU can and should cooperate when it comes to EU southern neighborhoods. In my personal opinion, lack of cooperation is not a choice, but given the concerns about Turkey's reliability, I think there is a lot of question mark about the future of that cooperation as well. I will stop here and I would look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinem. Very good points. I also took a couple of points that you underlined. Samuel, welcome. So after Sinem, you will also have 15 minutes. Samuel, hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Doveri Westerby from European Neighborhood Council. So Senem already underlined a couple of points about Turkey relations. I saw your tweets that before coming to this webinar. So you put a couple of points, I guess you want to talk about scenarios, bilaterals, defense, security, customs union, traditional versus personalization. So we want to elaborate on these points. You have 15 minutes as well.
Thank you very much, Didem. Also, thank you very much to Alper for inviting me, and thank you very much to Sinem. Hi, Sinem, and thank you for the comments and analysis. If it's a little bit noisy, I would just want to apologize to start with. I'm in the European Parliament. I just came out of another event, so sometimes some people walk past, and if you can't hear me, I apologize. I can try to say it again. So while trying to answer the question about how the Ukraine war impacts EU-Turkey relations, I think it's paramount to properly analyze, firstly, why the Ukraine war is such an unusual and highly impactful factor of influence in the EU-Turkey relationship, with very significant and potential outcomes, particularly when analyzed from a state-centric perspective. And secondly, not only the Ukraine war is an impactful factor on the EU-Turkey relationship, but there are also other important factors which equally need to be taken into consideration. There are many, but namely, I will talk about the individual choices of the Turkish president, what I refer to as the Erdogan security dilemma, and also other important factors of Turkish revisionism, neutrality, and what is referred to as perpetual hedging. So I will look at these different factors with a few more details on energy cooperation, security, defense cooperation, customs union, connectivity, defense, all of the points that Didem just mentioned before, or whatever we have time for. And maybe in the last 5 minutes, I know that I have 15 minutes and then 5 minutes afterwards, I can maybe talk a little bit about recommendations and also how it impacts democracy and pluralism and what the EU and Turkey should do. So first, why does the Ukraine war, why is it so decisive on EU-Turkey relations and more broadly on Turkey-NATO and US-Turkey relations? Well, due to the US and EU sanctions against Russia, as well as auto sanctions and higher insurance premiums for working inside of Russia, as well as protests on the borders that we witnessed in Poland, and the general instability and the halting of the northern trading route in terms of connectivity of energy and goods, including logistics. So as a consequence of all of that, an enormous rerouting of over 1 million containers. Now it's more. It was 1 million containers already a few months ago, and the estimates also a few months ago was 250,000 trucks. When I was meeting with the logistics companies in Turkey, these were the estimations. And all of these are now rerouted in maritime routes to reach Europe from Asia, and other traffic is being deviated through what we refer to as the middle corridor, which is basically Turkey. So this logic, of course, doesn't only apply to logistics and trade, it also applies to the energy sector, where Turkey equally is benefiting from the promised decrease in energy supply from Russia, since Turkey can provide energy transit options from other destinations, the Caspian, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean basin. Since I have limited time, I'm not going to go into specific detail about each one of those, but basically, there are lots of considerations to be made about those energy transits, whether it's technical viability, political blocks, investments, member state preferences within the EU. So maybe if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to answer that in detail in the Q&A. Coming back to the point of before, Turkey therefore finds itself in a new geostrategically favorable position and in a heightened competition with Russia, while also a far more significant position vis-a-vis the West. So here I'm not saying that Turkey wasn't important before, it truly was and truly has been, but Ankara's importance has significantly grown since February vis-a-vis the West. So Western NATO allies, namely US, Canada, UK, and many EU member states as well, now see Turkey as, number one, a provider of alternative energy sources from Russia. That's Azerbaijan, Iraq, Iran, Israel, Cyprus, Egypt, some of them potential, some of them currently operating. Secondly, a provider of defense equipment to Ukraine. So here, of course, the Bayraktar drones are considerable, and Turkey's defense industry is growing, and the price quality advantage is also very beneficial. And then number three, a provider of support and unity inside of NATO. This point, of course, has been somewhat discredited in recent weeks as a result of the fiasco, which is Finland and Sweden. I mean, essentially, without going into too much detail about that, Sweden has hosted what most Turkish diplomats would call affiliated PKK or PKK stakeholders, and received donations and run organizations with them. The Swedish diplomats say that Turkey's terror law definition is too vague, while many speculate that Turkey is using these points to simply cover the fact that they want concessions from the US in the end, probably on armament industry. Ongoing discussions look like both Sweden and Finland may remove restrictions on defense license exports from 2019. But demands like extradition of people from Sweden and Turkey, from Sweden to Turkey is pretty unrealistic, considering the fact that both Sweden and Finland have to abide by the rule of law, and of course have to take into account judicial process in due time. Then additionally, coming back to the point of before, Turkey is of course a provider of transport, trade, supply chains, rerouted Kazakhstan container ships, trucking through the dry ports there. And this is also a reason why the West sees Ankara quite favorably, as being able to reroute some of that, as well as, for example, via ferry boat from Aktau to Baku. There are currently 2 ferry boats, so it's not a tremendous amount of logistical availability, but there are some ferry boats available in order to do that. Then perhaps the last point is a provider of kind of new military defense lines with potential for procurement and new tech, with of course the Ukraine war has exacerbated a need for, considering the very fast form of armament that we're supplying Ukraine with. And despite some disagreements which have existed over the SAMP-T negotiations with France and Italy, which is land-to-air missile systems, positive developments are happening instead with the Eurofighter Typhoons, which is currently under negotiations with BAE Systems, Airbus, and Leonardo. So what's the result of this on EU-Turkey relations? Well, ideally, these factors should lead to the reinstitutionalization of relations, meaning less transactional relations and a renewed interest in EU accession, customs union, visa liberalization, migration deal, possibly defense cooperation under PESCO, energy harmonization, and starting with, of course, on energy harmonization would be a good step, would be the opening of the chapters under the acquis. But as I also heard, it was mentioned before, at the moment, relatively little of this is happening. It's true that on a technical and high level political dialogue between Turkey and the EU and NATO has increased since February. So there are more meetings, which is a positive thing. But overall, the results in improved EU-Turkey
I guess we lost the connection with Samuel. Maybe you'll be back. Samuel, can you hear us? He still looks connected to the meeting, but yeah, he's back now. We lost you, but I guess you are back, Samuel. Can you hear us? But
I can hear you.
I guess, yes, you are back.
More or less, where did you lose me?
Just a couple of last couple of minutes, really, not that long.
Okay, good. Well, in that case, as I mentioned before, or was finishing mentioning, is what has the result been on all of this in EU-Turkey relations? One would expect a lot of positive development, but unfortunately, at the moment, relatively little of this is happening. There's more technical and political dialogue meetings in place, but unfortunately, the tensions in the East Med and among the littoral states in the Eastern Mediterranean are showing that the Ukraine war is not providing as much momentum in positive EU-Turkey relations as one could have expected. So then the question becomes, why exactly is the Ukraine war not improving the EU-Turkey relations? And here there are two other sets of factors beyond the Ukraine war, which can kind of help explain that. The first one, I would say, is because of a secondary set of factors which counter the Ukraine war. And these are basically Turkish revisionism, Turkish strategic neutrality, and Turkish perpetual hedging vis-a-vis the US, Russia, and China. So basically, in a nutshell, the Ukraine war is forcing Turkey to look westwards, but the new multipolar environment, which the US, China, Russia are in competition over, foster a new type of incentive for Turkey to basically perpetually hedge. One superpower against the other, one can say, while trying to bargain continuously for a better deal. Now, the danger of this is when to stop or when to strike the best deal in this type of bidding war, while avoiding too many, let's say, metaphorically speaking, casualties along the way, or maybe even non-metaphorically speaking. And that's because this strategy of Turkey increases dramatically the risk of escalation or even mistake, since this process constantly tries to seek a better deal. And that's because in this period, the interactions, as was mentioned before as well, will be extremely transactional in an increasingly hostile climate of first of all, great superpower competition, which is basically the opposite of institutionalized relationships of trust and rules. And it's therefore a high-risk strategy, and opting for neutrality along the way, of course, fits Turkish revisionism ideals of nationalism quite well, since it allows for Turkey to gain leverage over Russia, China, and the US, and also the EU, in order to, for example, try to regain territories, concessions, trade advantages, energy, and other so-called profits deemed important for Ankara. So again, the big risk in this strategy remains that it is both risky in terms of escalation chances and also opening conflict in so many theaters simultaneously, as well as the risk of not being able to choose a side once the bidding is over, because relations and trust have been exhausted or damaged so badly. So specifically for EU-Turkey relations, this scenario is pretty damaging. I mean, I can't imagine, there are more damaging scenarios, but this is a very damaging one. And to some degree, it's what we have been witnessing for some years, since the abrupt failure of Turkey's EU accession bid, and notably due to the 2004 Cypriot bloc, followed by Turkish democratic backsliding, and the EU not taking Turkey's security concerns very seriously, and perhaps also to add the Turkish government's unwillingness to reform or change, especially in the last decade. So what is clear is that this transactional relationship leads to things like the 2016 migration deal, which is today an unsustainable yet quite practical agreement that doesn't really tackle the root of the problem. The root of the problem, of course, being climate change, war, and poverty. And the source of illegal migration and refugees is really not handled in a sustainable way as a result of this transactional climate. So very few areas which could still lead to cooperation in a transactional sense exist, and there are some defense deals. We could imagine that, and here the Ukraine war and BA systems seem to be applicable. And also cooperation against Russia in certain areas like the Black Sea, But overall, these factors are more transactional and really not conducive towards an ingrained EU-Turkey relationship, and not really a Turkey-NATO-US relationship either. So then the third and the final set of factors which may also be influencing significantly EU-Turkey relations today is what I would refer to as the Erdogan factor, or the Erdogan security dilemma, as well as the rise of populism and Eurasianism and anti-NATO sentiments inside of Turkey. I won't go too much into detail about that, since I think I have a limited amount of time, and also many of you probably already know about this. But I think perhaps what's just very, in a nutshell, important to mention is that a significant factor of influence in Turkish policy vis-a-vis the US, NATO, and to a lesser degree, but also the EU, is of course the Turkish president himself. That's largely due to domestic changes inside of Turkey over the past decade. The most obvious example is, of course, the presidential system, but there are also many other components which have exacerbated this. The informal power structure within of Turkey, as well as the failed coup and its aftermath, all of which have made the Turkish decision-making structure increasingly vertical and very dependent on the president himself, and as well as an inner circle or entourage of policymakers and specific ministries, as well as the AKP and the MIT. So the Turkish president's personalized and highly centralized decision-making is very influenced by, number one, his deep mistrust of the US. And I would also go as far as to say his tacit belief that the US was supportive of the 2016 failed coup, due in part to Gulen's permanent residency in Pennsylvania. This is very much a common belief in certain policy circles, all the way up to the presidency level. And then number two, his belief that democratization may eventually lead to a power sharing situation, which could mean the prosecution of himself, family, bank accounts, inner circle, and really considering Turkey's unforgiving history of persecuting people in power, he may have a point. So I think that's a very, very important set of factors as well, which deeply influence the Turkish decision-making vis-a-vis Europe and the West. So I will stop here and reserve my remaining 5 minutes for any points on recommendations. And if you have questions in more detail about energy or defense, I'm happy to answer those in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. I guess this Sinem and your speeches, they really contributed to each other in a very nice way. So you all underlined some issues that maybe we didn't discuss much, this personalized network in the bureaucracy, and also, presidentialization of the system, how it is affecting change, policy making in defense and other foreign policy as well. And also changing global dynamics, which is also, I guess, having an impact on EU-Turkey relations. So now we have Alper Kaliber from Altınbaş University, the discussant. Alper, I guess you will have 10, 12 minutes, right? Then I will give floor again to our speakers, 5 more minutes, so they can, reply back to Alper, or they can add more points if they like. Any questions from audience, they can put in the chat box, then we can try to address. Alper, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Didem. And I also thank to our speakers today, Sinem and Samuel. Yeah, this is the closing event of our Jean Monnet chair on security, migration, society in Europe. And it's very timely and also overlapping, really, discussing these issues. Overlaps with the aims and content of this Jean Monnet chair. So Sinem and Samuel have raised many important points. I won't be reacting to all of these, and I mean, I agree with them over 90 points, 90% what they see and say. So I will just talk about some general points which inspired me while I'm listening to Sinem and Samuel. Right. So there is obviously a discontent with the West and even a vehement anti-Westernism in Turkish foreign policy. Actually, this is a trend which overlaps with the increasingly thickening of populist streak in Turkish foreign policy, and especially since the Gezi events, demonstrations, and then, I mean, this has crystallized obviously after the failed coup attempt, as Samuel also pointed out. Then Turkey began to sort of articulate all foreign policy issues in a certainly identity politics manner. I mean, everything from the military operations to Syria, the Eastern Mediterranean disputes have been experienced and expressed as issues of survival. I mean, even if you look at this Turkey's veto on Finnish and Swedish accession, you know, this has been also articulated as something directly related to survival of Turkey. I mean, of course, in the literature, there is this has been studied for different cases in many times, and when the elites in power identify their security with regime security, then they sort of recalibrate their foreign and security policy, where all the issues have been defined due to different reasons as issues of survival. So we have already anti-Westernism, securitization, and even sort of militarization of Turkish foreign policy. And also there is sort of a quest for autonomy, and because Turkish elites seem to sense that we at least live in a post-Western world. China and Russia they are also increasing, and more importantly, unilateralism is increasing. I mean, it seems that there is a sort of a friction, tension, and even sort of let's say and contradiction between the powers who were in favor of more rule of law and the powers who want to unilaterally act. So for instance, you know, in a very last crisis, with the last minute verdict of European Convention, European Court of Human Rights, I mean, the court prevented, just canceled and a plane to take off. You know, this plane was carrying some asylum seekers and migrants. It was bringing them to Rwanda, you know, the last British policy on that, but then the court, just with a last minute decision, managed to stop this flight. So, but then British politicians heavily criticized the court. So, I mean, there is such a tension in international order, as I said, between the powers who want to have more international norms and rules established, and others who want rather to prefer exceptional measures and unilateralism. So, China, Russia are, of course, increasingly situated in the second camp. And when I talk to European, bureaucrats, and I also get I sense that Turkey is increasingly situated somewhere in between democracies and autocracies. I mean, even closer to autocracies, and also these powers who want to practice exceptionalist and unilateral actions. And a second point, as Samuel also has pointed out, and Sinem also mentioned, yeah, Turkey just vetoed the Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO, and there is a growing self-confidence among Turkish elite that, first of all, I mean, as this is increasingly post-Western world, so Turkey is a rising power, and the last war against Ukraine has also shown that in one way or another, the Western powers always need Turkey and Turkish, you know, geopolitical assets and even some military assets. But they also tend to decouple Turkey's EU perspective and its NATO, its situation in NATO. I mean, of course, NATO and EU is very different institutions. They are very different institutions. But I mean, the war on Ukraine has changed many things in Europe, and NATO and EU has increasingly become sort of identified with each other, or as institutions representing the Western values. So, I mean, it is actually not so easy for Turkey to, you know, decouple Turkey's positions for the EU and for NATO. And I guess the EU is watching closely this accession story and Turkey's veto to Finnish and Swedish accession. So, I mean, when this crisis, I mean, if this crisis grinds on, obviously this would be criticized by the EU, and it will be implicated in Turkey-EU relations as well. So I agree with Sinem that, I mean, the opportunities to repair Turkey-EU relations have been wasted. Of course, Turkey has many advantages, you know, geopolitical, geostrategic, or it could have been an alternative, you know, energy route. And as Samuel said, there are, I think, some negotiations on that. There is some potentialities, and also there are even some working, you know, operations on that. But if Turkey, I think, had made some democratizing reforms, or even if we didn't see such verdicts that we have seen in Kavala case, you know, this war or this crisis could have been more favorable for Turkey. But it seems that all these democratizing, I mean, backsliding in democratic institutions, eroding of democratic institutions and rule of law, highly diminished and inflicted Turkey's status, and that's why Turkey is not in a position to further, you know, make it more relevant to Western and European actors. And as just last point, I mean, we know in Turkey that throughout the whole Cold War, and even in 1990s after the Cold War, Turkish politicians have always mentioned how Turkey is geostrategically and geopolitically important, and indispensable for the West. And this view was often accepted, by the Western powers, so much so that Turkey's very heavy human rights violations were often, tolerated to a large extent. But now we are living in a totally different world. You cannot compromise human rights, rule of law, just for the sake of security. We live in such a world that security and human rights, rule of law are understood as the two sides of the same coin. So what Turkish elites misses is that, they, I think that in such a world, in such a Europe where geopolitics has returned, so Turkey has many advantages and it can offer many sort of security benefits to Europe, and then democratic lack of democratic credentials in Turkey will not be problematized, in a very heavy manner. So, but this is actually wrong, and Turkey will just experience the results of that if more heavily if the war in Ukraine grinds on. Thank you very much. These are my points.
Thank you, Alper. I will give again floor back to Sinem first, and then Samuel, if they want to reflect, back to Alper, or if they want to add more points. But I will also take the opportunity of being the moderator and want to ask, if you want to talk about the importance of economic crisis in Turkey, how will change the picture, or the upcoming elections, this kind of stress tension in the society, how will it change the scenarios that you have in your mind about the EU-Turkey relations? And second point, what is the role of opposition? We talk about anti-Westernism. This is my point of view, but when we look at the main opposition parties, we are also not seeing that they are that much passionate about EU-Turkey relations. So maybe we can address two points as well, economic crisis, upcoming elections on one point, and opposition. How they will change if they, imagine we have any government after elections. Do you think things will change? Okay, Sinem, let's start with you. Then we will continue with Samuel.
Thank you, Didem. I already had noted 4 points to make. Now with the questions you raised, that will be 6 points, and I'll try to basically confine them, hopefully even less than 5 minutes. So the first point is when Samuel was mentioning this high-risk strategy. I agree about the high-risk part. I'm not very sure about the strategy, and it's a genuine question, whether there is really a strategy in Turkish foreign policy when it comes to relations with the West. I think one can talk about strategy in specific files. For instance, let it be TNRC, Turkish TRNC, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and the strategy there is that we see over the years a shift from integration of Northern Cyprus in a federated system to integration of Northern Cyprus in a confederated system, and finally now we are in the phase of a two-state solution. That, I think, is basically reflects that there is some strategy in the part of Turkish foreign policy. Or one can also, I think, talk about strategy or some strategic thinking when it comes to Turkish policy in northern Syria and in connection to that in Iraq, and it's kind of as part of Turkey's forever war against the PKK. But when it comes to the relations with the West, I really question, and that's really a genuine question, I ask myself whether there is a strategy or it's just basically an amalgamation of tactics. And that kind of brings me to the second point, which is about anti-Westernism, because the way I see it is that after the war erupted, as the war continues and so on, it looks like that Turkey is actually drifting haphazardly. between the West and the so-called West and the so-called East, let it be Russia, let it be China, and so on. And that, to me, like one significant factor for that is actually what Samuel also mentioned, is kind of like these different actors and cliques within the Turkish state, if you will. And we see that like really in the first 1.5 months after the war, that both the public discussion in Turkey, but also statements coming from government officials, there, I think in the first 1.5 months, like you see actually the president taking a quite, I think, pro-Western position, one could say, and also advocating NATO expansion and so on. And as opposed to that, you see, for instance, AKP's junior partner, MHP, is criticizing Erdogan's statements about NATO expansion and pushing for a more kind of anti-Western position. And when it comes to, like Samuel mentioned, Euro-Asianists and the so-called Ulusalcılar and so on, there you also in the public discussion in the Turkish TV and so on, you see a quite like strong anti-NATO, anti-Americanism, and that has to do with the current moment, but that also has to do with historical grievances that go back to the Cold War, and so on. So that there are like these different actors constantly competing with each other at a moment when I think the Turkish state institutions are actually at a historical low in terms of like their strength, and kind of like waiting for a reset, right? And historically, the reset either came in the form of a coup d'etat or in the form of an early election, but neither of them is possible today. So the system cannot really reset itself. So that's kind of like the second point. And that's why I think like because of these kind of the tensions and the conflicts among different actors within Turkey, political actors, I think that to a certain extent contributes to this haphazard drifting of Turkey from the West and this kind of zigzagging. You know, one day you support NATO expansion, 2 weeks after you are suddenly against it. So like, and it's very difficult to kind of really explain it in a coherent way. At least it has been very difficult for me as a Turkey analyst to explain it coherently. And the third point is about what Alper was mentioning about the survival of the regime. I totally agree. I think it's in a way one could even argue, and I wrote about this recently in a piece, that Turkey's post-Cold War, both post-Cold War concerns about the possibility that Turkey's strategic importance might be diminished because that there is no longer a Soviet Union, and second, that Turkey's post-Cold War ambitions to situate Turkey as a power within its own neighborhood. I think they have been taken, both the concerns and both the ambitions were taken actually by the current government in Turkey, and under the survival almost instincts in the last, like, since 2016, they in a way became a kind of like a constant rhetorical cry outs for being considered on par with the US and the EU at the expense of an increasing dependency on Russia. And again, this goes back to the initial point that I made, that this haphazard drifting away from the West. The fourth point is about the Turkey democratization or a democratizing process forced in Turkey and so on. Now, I'm not like, and again, this is also like really not a rhetorical or not a cynical comment, like because I have been lately thinking a lot about the connection between confrontational and, if you will, even militaristic foreign policy and democratization or lack thereof. Because I think you can actually find evidence for both arguments, right? That's democratic deficit leads to a confrontational foreign policy, and arguments for there is no connection between democratic deficit and confrontational foreign policy, or vice versa. If democracy inside might actually prevent a confrontational foreign policy, and a good example of that maybe would be US, for that matter. So I'm a little bit like I'm basically, this is all to say that I'm not 100% sure whether, if there is a change in Turkey towards a democratic path, if you will, in the most kind of procedural sense of the term, I'm not sure whether that would immediately lead to a less confrontational foreign policy. And that kind of brings me to the question about the role of the opposition. I think when it comes to the foreign policy and relations with the EU and the West, I mean, we see it again in the first 1.5 months after the war erupted, that if you look at the statements coming from the opposition parties, but also civil society groups that are close to the opposition parties, you see that there has been a strong emphasis on the fact that the opposition sees the West as a system of values. So NATO is a basically democratic institution, and that's why we want, as the opposition parties, Turkey, to be kind of like anchored very strongly within Western institutions, because that's the only way to kind of keep going and democratize the country and so on. Yet at the same time, I mean, I certainly think that there is definitely a truth in that. That's the way they see it. But that's also, I think, a tactical move to kind of counter the current government, again, against the backdrop of its own highly strong anti-Westernist tones, undertones, and so on. And when it comes to the foreign policy, if there is a change in the government, my sense is that the style and the conduct of diplomacy, as I said earlier, will definitely be different. But when it comes to the threat perceptions, I don't think, again, when it comes to those like long-standing files, Greece, Cyprus, and now add to that also Eastern Mediterranean and the Kurdish question, I don't necessarily see there will be a very, very big change. When it comes to the question about economic crisis, I mean, I'm currently in Turkey, and I was in Turkey in October as well, and I could tell that, I mean, it's really stark, the price increases and so on in the last like 6 months. And then if you like speak with friends, family, colleagues, and so on, like they would even tell you that even within the course of a day, the price change is significant. And I think this whole process and the insistence on unorthodox economic policies, one outcome of that is, of course, the erosion of the middle class. And I think that has been, now one can criticize kind of like the Turkish Republic, especially the foundational decades of the Turkish Republic and so on. But I think one positive development of, if you will, Turkish nation building and development was actually the kind of like foundation and nourishment of a strong middle class. And now that is at risk of eroding, and I see it as very significant problem and a challenge also for the opposition parties if they come to power. And when it comes to the question about whether the economic crisis, I mean, what would be the kind of implications of the current economic crisis on possible change in power? I mean, if you look at the history of the Turkish Republic, economic crises like this always led to a change in government. Yet at the same time, I think we are also in a quite kind of perhaps even uncomparable moment in the history of the Turkish Republic when it comes to, mainly because of the presidential system and the institutional deterioration that it led to. And there, and again, this is kind of like more my own, this is kind of like speaking out loud. I don't have a clear answer to that. But sometimes I have the feeling that when we talk about economic crises, we kind of like try to read it almost single-handedly by putting the focus on the president himself, and kind of overlook the elites, like economic elites, that this system has created in the last 10 to 20 years. Because again, there the kind of the point is that Indonesia, Malaysia, right, 1998, like both were hit by an economic crisis, but in Indonesia, economic crisis led to a government change and return to a democracy, whereby in Malaysia, it actually accentuated the authoritarian regime. So there, like, I'm not like 100% sure whether an economic crisis would naturally lead to a change in government. I think there are other factors at play. So therefore, it's kind of like, I don't know the answer, and I will leave it there.
Thank you, Sinem. I mean, I'm working on corruption, and generally corruption and the economic crisis are more likely to change the government, and none of them did until so far in Turkey. So that's, I guess, quite, happening in Turkey. I guess changing societal dynamics is quite, having an impact, as you already, gave the example of Malaysia, Indonesia. So Samuel, do you want to add, reflect on Alper's points or add some new points? Again, yeah. Opposition, economic crisis, if you want to follow up.
Yeah. So I will just add to what Sinem said with regards to Turkey's drifting between East and West. Logically speaking, that's a strategy in itself. I mean, it's wrong to say it's a strategy in itself, but it's a tactic, as you said. It can be a tactic in itself. If one has to achieve the best deal between two poles, then constant drifting without releasing any information about it is how you achieve the ultimate best deal. So whether or not that's purposefully done or not, that is totally impossible to know, but logically speaking, it makes sense. And whether it's a government strategy, you're probably right, it probably isn't. But whether it's a one-man show who is strategizing the whole thing, probably, in my opinion, is what we're looking at. Now, with regards to the economic crisis, I think maybe just linking it to democracy really quickly, I come from the school of opinion, and I know that people differ on this, but I come from the school of opinion in which institutions and incentives drive democratization. Others come from the opinion that it innately comes from societies and springs out of something which I'm unsure what it springs out of, maybe cultural change or some kind of lucky moment in history, a spark, I don't know. But I come from the institutional perspective that says incentive can lead to democratization. Under that premise, Turkey is in a rather dire situation right now because of the Ukraine crisis having decreased the chances increased the chances of Turkey being relevant to the West. Hence, democracy becomes less of a priority. And number two, because of the deinstitutionalized nature of the relationship, as a result, incentives won't lead to democracy. So in that sense, that's quite negative. So how is there any potential for democracy in Turkey? I would say in two ways. Number one is by focusing specifically on the three factors that matter to Turkish people and that are linked to democracy. And those are what's it called, migration, they are the economy, and they are cultural, so secularism versus Islam. I mean, there are also other factors, but I would definitely boil them down to these three, and over 50% of the Turkish population generally care about this. And it's not necessarily formulated as democracy, but it's a type of pluralism that every single person in Turkey, one way or the other, understands. So I think that's very important on how that's framed, and there is potential of it in those three sectors specifically. But I think on topics of Osman Kavala and rule of law and technical speciality in democratization, I think that's a very, very difficult road to take if trying to convince a population of its importance. Then with regards, just very briefly, because with regards to with the EU and bilaterals, we haven't really spoken so much about that, and I think that's a very important point to maybe just very briefly add, is that I know that a lot of attention has been placed on the EU and Turkey over the past few decades because of the accession process and because of the importance of that institutionalized process. But in the last few years, and now exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, what we're much more likely to see is bilateral relations developing, not necessarily in competition within the EU, but just much more council as opposed to commission. So I think that's very, very important when thinking about the relationship with Turkey, because then all of a sudden it becomes a question of Poland, Spain, Italy, Germany, and also non-EU European countries like Ukraine and also UK. So that's also maybe just important to mention. And then maybe just briefly coming back to what I was speaking about before, and this combination of sets of factors which we're witnessing today. In order to avoid that the secondary and third set of factors, namely revisionism, neutrality, as well as the personalized Erdogan factor, really become very, very important, and the running urgent policy choices of the upcoming 12 months and gradual policy choices of the next decade, I think it's quite important to maybe follow a small list of recommendations. I would say that the West should realize that they're not bargaining with Turkey of the 1990s or of the 2000s. It has a new status, and new concessions have to be respected, which could either mean a pursuit of a type of accession, or much more realistically, a second best type of equal partnership with customs union, maybe PESCO, EDF, energy corporation, and so forth. I think it's key that the West concedes to Ankara's southern flank concerns vis-a-vis the PKK, and also in return tries to attempt to reinstitutionalize a relationship to avoid what we've been talking about before, this transactional spiral, which just exacerbates tensions. And then, as I also mentioned before, I know it's probably a controversial thing, but I think logically speaking, it's a total necessity that among political parties in Turkey, perhaps with support from international actors like Switzerland, Qatar, or EU countries, that a degree of protection is given to all political leaders in Turkey, like family protection, bank account guarantees protection, basically to stop the disincentive to give up power after or during any election, which is a fundamental incentive problem in Turkey, and which simply won't go away unless this kind of procedure is at least thought of, either publicly or privately. That I can't speak of, but something along those lines. And then I think also for the Turkish public, it's important that the majority of Turkish people realize that perpetual bargaining leads to higher chances of risk, and the need to either adopt, for example, a customs union with conditions, or reintegration into the EU structures from an institutional point of view is really an essential ingredient in order to avoid the exacerbation of this risk that we've been talking about a little bit. And then I think on democracy, because this was mentioned as well, the risk of democracy becoming a secondary priority in Turkey is of course real, as I mentioned before. And I think that the institutional relationship with accession is likely to have much of a positive impact on that. But I would say for people who are following democracy and who are carefully working on that subject, what really needs to be looked into is the impact of due diligence legislation, and how that is going to impact the Turkish supply chains, notably the due diligence legislation from Germany, because the EU one will be watered down quite a lot. But the due diligence legislation from Turkey, or from Germany, is extremely comprehensive and is very penalizing, and a little bit depending on how it's going to be implemented, both on the judicial side in German courts, as well as in terms of whether it will be a certification type of implementation or more NGO monitoring implementation, will very much have an impact on how potential worker right, human rights, democracy can basically flourish or not in Turkey.
Thank you, Samuel. Alper, do you wanna follow up, or do you wanna reply, comments, add more?
No, I won't. I mean, I don't have anything to add, basically, but just maybe I can start with the Q&A session with a one question, maybe to Samuel. Samuel, you said that there's already going on, cooperation on energy and defense sector, and there are some potential ways to further make a progress on that. So could you be more elaborate on that? I'm sure you have some important information that we don't have. So could you please give more details on that?
Yeah. So on defense, I will be a bit more brief. There's negotiations undergoing with regards to BA systems, and there's also negotiations undergoing both with Leonardo and with Thales, the French company. The difference between the two is that there is still a lot of dispute with regards to the SAMP-T, so the French one with Leonardo, whereas it seems to be much closer to conclusion with BA systems. Now, with regards to energy, there are only 3 avenues, realistic avenues of energy diversification for Turkey, taking into account that the final consumer will be the Turkish market and the EU market, and also maybe Western Balkans. The first one is from Azerbaijan, Shah Deniz 1 and Shah Deniz 2. That's the most established one. It's the one that's already pumping between 8 and 10 BCM, and the one that will be expanded further. It will be going through the Trans-Adriatic pipeline and TANAP, as well as the Caucasian part of the line. So that's really the most realistic one, the one that's already underway, and the one that the EU has deemed a special project of interest for over a decade and has invested a lot in. Then there are the other ones which are popularized in the media on a bit haphazard occasions, and sometimes there's a lot of hope about them, and sometimes some of that hope deflates again. One of them is the Eastern Mediterranean basin. What we know at the current moment is that Vasilikos LNG floating terminal, fixed terminal in Cyprus is basically inexistent and will not be functional for many years. So one can forget about the idea that LNG will be taken from Tamar or Leviathan or Aphrodite and be exported there for world consumption. When it comes to Israel, there's domestic personal consumption currently underway, and there's export capability both to Egypt, which is being done through a pipeline, and there's also some export going to Jordan. But it's very limited and small scale because it's reserved to the Israeli discoveries, and does not include Zohr in Egypt, nor Aphrodite in the Cypriot territorial waters. And then we have the 2 dormant terminals in Egypt. Those ones can be used as a form of exportation of EastMed energy to the world in a normal way, in LNG fashion. But the problem here, again, is that in order to do so, it would necessitate many of the different discoveries to be pooled together and shipped to the LNG terminals in Egypt. And there's a lot of disagreement from the US especially about doing this, because the US would like to include or involve Turkey in one way or the other in this. Israel is also flirting with this idea, and that's the reason why at ministerial level they're meeting quite regularly. Then, of course, comes this idea of a pipeline. How does one assemble all of these discoveries to make it commercially viable, and then pipeline it either to Greece or to Turkey? These are the only options left. I mean, there's also the Middle Eastern Arab pipeline, but that's out of the question because of Syria. So these 2 pipelines are left, and the US embassy released a very interesting statement some months ago, basically tacitly saying that a long pipeline all the way to Greece would be environmentally unfriendly and very costly and strategically unwise. That basically means, in lack of a better word, that the pipeline to Greece is not underway. So that leaves the pipeline to Turkey. But the problem with the pipeline to Turkey, which would be going to the coast of Turkey, is that it would have to cross through the Cypriot territorial waters. And this is a major issue. I don't know how that would be solved, but this is a bit the picture of the East Med, let's say. Then, I mean, it's a rather long discussion, but in a very fast nutshell, maybe. Iraq is also somewhat unfeasible, but it's primarily unfeasible because of Iran. If developments are made in Iraq, likelihood is that PKK or other sub-terrorist groups could become, let's say, guns for hire or something like that of Iran to conduct terrorist attacks on a pipeline, which Iran would see as circumventing their own energy needs. There are multiple examples of this over the last decade. And then when it comes to Iran, the obvious problem is the JCPOA. The United States and Israel are fervently against, and also many Arab Gulf states. And as a result, this enormous capacity of energy it cannot transit through Turkey. And then we move on to the Caspian. I spoke about Azerbaijan briefly. The other only two real contenders is Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Kazakhstan to a lesser degree, and Turkmenistan to a very much higher degree, as Turkmenistan is estimated to have between 4th and 6th highest gas reserves in the world. The problem with Turkmenistan is really kind of multifold. The first problem is that even though the littoral states have delineated the boundaries since 2018 at their meeting in Aktau, there are still environmental clauses which basically allow for Iran and Russia to block pipelines going through the Caspian. Another problem which up until recently existed was the fact that Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan really disagreed on a variety of different issues with regards to the findings in the Caspian. They have now started cooperating more on a discovery named Serdar, after the son of the Turkmen leader, and there's development undergoing there, and there's also a variety of different international companies that are quite interested, and interestingly enough, the French company Total has now basically started seismic research in that area together with them as well, which is quite interesting too. Apart from that, in Turkmenistan, the actors, let's say the foreign actors which are involved is traditionally Eni, so the Italian energy giant. And at the moment, it's unlikely to foster any immediate results, but in the future, it has a potential. But one should also remember the eastern side, which is the Tapi pipeline that goes down to Afghanistan, which is competing with Turkmen gas. Not in terms of actual gas, because there's so much of it, but in terms of infrastructure investment, either going east or west.
Thank you, Samuel. So I'm looking at the audience. If they have any questions to our speakers, they can write in the chat box or they can ask themselves. There's a question in the chat box now from Nicola. I had a question: is Turkey playing a kind of 2 or even 3-level game towards the EU, NATO, and single EU countries, or the world community generally considered, for prestige aims? For instance, this is to try to understand the complexity of Turkish foreign policy within an established framework. Turkey, after all, has both a geographical position and institutional position within the NATO, yet outside the EU, and that enable it to pursue such a foreign policy strategy. Thank you. So I guess we already tried to underline, the complexity, or if there is any strategy of Turkish foreign policy towards the West, as Sinem underlined. But if you want to take up the question and reply, the floor is yours.
I mean, I guess the easy and the shortest answer is that I don't know. I really don't know. But one thing is, and this is not a direct answer to the question, is that, and again, this is something that I have been thinking about lately, that, I mean, we always approach the issue from, understandably so, of course, from the perspective of what Turkey is trying to do. And there, I sometimes have the feeling that we miss the point about, because, I mean, the point that Turkey has been a strong beneficiary of the changes in the international system in the last decade or so. And I think in the case of like what I said in my presentation at the beginning, that in the first 1.5 months after the war erupted, that in a way that rapid unity and unexpected unity within the West really challenged that Turkish assumption. But now, as these frictions and fractions are appearing more salient within the so-called West, I think in a way that kind of like that we might think of it as an enabling factor. And I think that kind of like lines up nicely with what Samuel was saying about like this Turkey trying to play different sides against each other and so on. So that kind of, I think, enables Turkish tactics, if you will, these divisions, both within the EU, but also within NATO, etc., etc. So that would be my answer. That's not an answer to the question, sorry, but I really don't know.
Samuel, do you want to add up something?
No, I think Sinem explained very well. I'm also not 100% sure about the question. I mean, if the question is,
it's more like a comment, I guess, you know.
If the question is there lots of bargaining going on, then yes, absolutely. I think Turkey is doing what Turkey needs to do to some degree, strategically speaking, which is bargain. I mean, you can look at it at the way in which I look at it is, there is very, very high geopolitical competition going on. We have moved away from unipolarity into multipolarity. And when you arrive in this area, there's a given amount of time. I mean, based on historical precedent, there's a given amount of time in which relations cement again. So there's this moment of instability where everyone is kind of, let's say, flirting with one another and trying to figure out whose side am I going to be on? How bad are the repercussions going to be for my business? You might have noticed when you're in the think tank community or with economists or logistics companies or God knows, government officials, everyone is sitting on the fence. They're not quite sure what will happen next. Insurance premiums are high. A lot of these things are undergoing and everyone's very uncertain. And that's because we live in this very complex moment of uncertainty. And in this moment, it is in Turkey's absolute advantage to bargain its national interest. That's my personal opinion. But the problem is, how far do you bargain and when do you stop? And in order to take that into consideration, I mean, that's up for the Turkish people, I guess, to think about. But that's a question of, number one, which side will give you the most? Number two, how bad should my relationships become with Russia and China and the West before it will create a problem if I then gain an alliance with them later? And also, while bargaining, you inevitably, as I mentioned before, you inevitably create friction. You open lots of theaters of contention because that's part of bargaining. And as a result, you escalate and you increase the chances of conflict. And that's a calculation to be made also by the Turkish government and people and whatnot about how much do I want to bet on getting versus how much of a danger am I putting myself in? Because when these very, very risky moments that we're living in right now erupt, Ukraine is one conflict, but very likely there may be others. I mean, what's happening at the moment is, as I mentioned before, going from unipolarity towards multipolarity and arguably towards bipolarity afterwards, similar to the Cold War, which was a state of stability. And so it's a high risk. It's very high risk to pursue that strategy for very long. It's an intelligent move to do it for a given amount of time. It's difficult to say how long exactly, but for a given amount of time, yeah. So I hope that maybe answers the question a bit.
Yeah, we have one more in the chat box, Tolga Demiryol from Altınbaş University as well. He came a bit late, so he has one comment and a question, I guess, on the chat box. So I'm trying to read, maybe summarize a bit. I was wondering if there are new EU-Turkey cooperation venues available post-Ukraine with regard to renewable energy cooperation between Turkey and the EU. EU's long-term energy security, not to mention climate action, depends on decarbonization and supplanting fossil fuels with renewables. What role, if any, could Turkey have in that area? I think we didn't address renewable energy, so if you want to take up that question, I mean, Samuel or Sinem.
I will pass. Leave it to Samuel.
Okay.
Yeah, I can only say that it's literally impossible for the European Union to fulfill its plans of reduce carbon emissions, wind and solar energy, without a very strong partnership with Turkey. It's just like numerically impossible. So I think it's a natural field of cooperation, and at the moment, especially solar power in Turkey is reasonably developed, and there's lots of potential for the EU to basically work with Turkey on that. So, and I see it also in meetings, not today, but on many other occasions here in Brussels, even though the energy chapter, unfortunately, in the accession process is closed, which is quite problematic, to be frank, even though I understand why it is closed. It's dual effects, in the sense that I understand why it's closed for political reasons, but at the same time, it has very, very negative impacts on, for example, pursuing cooperation in renewable energy, because the moment in which you don't have a regular institutionalized dialogue space, it decreases the chances of basically moving together on these topics. So this, maybe I deviate a little bit, but I think it's really relevant to this discussion. If we're in a situation in which we have areas where there is logical scope for cooperation, like climate change and renewables, but the structure doesn't permit us to do so, structure being the accession process, because these chapters are blocked, then the logical conclusion to that is either fix the accession process. I am of the school of thinking that that's not possible. Some others are more optimistic. And I would then suggest replace it with something, a new and equal partnership, a customs union plus, whatever it may be. Take half of the accession, take the least politically sensitive issues of the accession and put it over into a new framework. Whatever does the job. But that structural change is now needed.
Thank you, Samuel. I guess it's already happening, no? I mean, there are some cooperations going on irrespective of the level of democracy in Turkey. I mean, there is no name of it. That's how it looks like. Okay, we are reaching almost 90 minutes. Alper, please.
Yeah, just a very few sentences on that. I mean, as I said, for my project, I interviewed several people, and Sinem and Samuel were among those, obviously. But especially some EU officials revealed that climate change is the main area, prioritized area through which Turkey and EU cooperate in the near future, regardless of really what is happening in Turkey in terms of democratic backsliding. I know that technical negotiations are also going on. So, I mean, climate change is a very good opportunity, actually. You know, Turkey has some enriched sorts of renewable energy. And also, I think it's just very convenient for win-win scenarios. I mean, we are talking about a problem that is actually a threat for everybody. So climate destruction, climate emergency or crisis, whatever you call, I mean, it is a phenomenon that we all experience. So, I mean, that would be a very important and relevant area of cooperation for Turkey-EU relations.
Okay, so we are already reaching maybe almost more than 1.5 hours. So let's finish this webinar with this last words of Alper, which is open to cooperation on climate issues, less political, less risky for everyone. So in the long term, maybe it will trigger some other aspects of, democratic values. Thank you, Sinem. Thank you, Samuel, for this contribution to Jean Monnet Chair of Alper, and Alper for the great, acting as a great discussant. So we are closing the webinar here, and hope to see you maybe somewhere in the near future.
And Didem, thank you for this very nice, good moderation.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.